What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some new details about Greedfall 2, the upcoming sequel to Greedfall, of course, from developer Spiders, and we've finally gotten some information on it, including its initial release into early access. More on that in a moment, alongside a few other details all laid out in the Nacon Connect event, which talks about a bunch of games coming out being published, of course, by Nacon. Now, I do want to stress here towards the beginning that while this is fresh information, a lot of it, I would say, was in some ways a given. And they did not drop a gameplay trailer, but rather just a cinematic trailer for the most part that showed off the basics of the new setting and world that they're trying to build here. That said, this is remarkable for Spiders because this is their first sequel. They've never done that before. They've usually just made one game and moved on. But after the success of Greedfall, which is still their most successful game, they decided to make that sequel. So let's start with the most pressing information. As I mentioned, this is apparently getting an early access release sometime this summer, so in the next few months, which is interesting for a few reasons, I think. Mostly just because I certainly wasn't expecting an early access release for this. And my general thinking here is that Spiders is kind of known for janky AA games that just so happen to have a very interesting world and plot below them. So they likely just want to make this one as good as it can possibly be, using community feedback to push back against that barrier to more widespread attention they always seem to be brushing up against. All of that said, while we now know the early access release window, let's talk about what else they covered. A few different things, mostly in the form of an interview, so no accompanying footage for a lot of it, but they started out by talking about expanding the art. You see, Greedfall 2 is a sort of reverse role for the first Greedfall, which saw people from the continent establishing colonies on Tier 4D. Whereas this game, you'll be playing a native from the Isle of Tier 4D, being brought to the continent and then getting involved in politics, factions, and looking at the spread of the Malachor plague that was central to the plot of the first game. With that transition comes a larger expansion of both the world at play, the universe of Greedfall, if you will, which includes things like looking at factions and expanding what you're going to see visually to be associated with that. Because, as for instance, just with the Malachor plague itself, we saw a little bit of that, of course, infecting a few individuals, but Tier 4D is largely free of that plague, so it didn't come up nearly as much as it could in a place where that's a more central theme. And in talking about those things, they also revealed a few other details about how that's going to work. For starters, they of course confirmed factions, like I've mentioned, and that we will have companions that represent each of those factions. But what's more, it's going to play into Spiders' approach to choice and consequence, where depending on how you handle certain situations, companions can leave you, depending on which factions you're siding with and what you're doing for them. Which, as a consequence of those choices that you're making, will lead to several different endings for the game, which is pretty standard for Spiders, not new information there, more expected than anything, alongside the confirmation of romances. Now, one slightly more interesting detail that they mentioned there, because I'm not entirely sure what they mean by it, is that the game will be non-linear. And that's a broad term, so I'm curious if they mean non-linear in the sense of their previous titles, or if they're trying to paint with a broader brush, so to speak, this time. But then, finally, to end on, we also got confirmation of some interesting details about combat, mostly being that they want to take a more tactical approach. Greedfall could, especially if you knew what you were doing with a good build, turn into a bit of a spam fest, and they would like combat to be more tactical, as they put it, which this time will involve managing a party of 4 rather than just your main character who happens to have 2 followers. So presumably that means outfitting and controlling them in combat in some way, though the details of that were left vague. I sincerely doubt they're moving away from the sort of action-oriented combat of the first title in favor of anything else. More likely that you're simply giving directions to them in some manner, probably via some sort of fly menu, in combat, as a bit of speculation on my part. But to wrap this video up, I'm glad that we got some more information about Greedfall 2 here. It's a game I've been waiting on for quite some time. It's been in development for quite some time. Though I do think its early access release will make things a little more awkward on my end, really, because I do not generally review early access titles, but obviously I'll be covering this, and I suppose the nature and depth of that coverage really depends on just how much there is to talk about when it is in early access and how long it spends there, as a matter of fact, because I think it is hardly a secret or anything that sometimes games get released into early access and then languish there for a few years before being released fully, if at all. And while I think for studios like Spiders, it's very safe that this will actually get released from early access into a launch version, I'm just curious about how long they might spend there and what the scope of what they're trying to add and change about the game from that early access period actually is. Are they just trying to add a little more polish to a mostly done experience, or are they actually trying to fully involve the community that might make sweeping changes to the gameplay in some manner? So it'll be very curious to see what state this game is in when it releases into early access, but you can be assured that I will absolutely be covering it, as I enjoyed the first title a great deal. But that's pretty much going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, hope you found it informative. Let me know what you think about all this down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.